Hi, my name is Peter Moe and I'm from Tourism Ireland's Nordic office in Copenhagen. Today we will be talking about Dublin's iconic music studio, Windmill Lane Recording Studios, where artists such as U2, Rolling Stones, and many more have recorded albums. We have the perfect person with us here today to enlighten us on this, Aidan Alcock, director at Windmill Lane Recording Studios. Now, Aidan, you're very welcome to our show today. Would you mind telling our listeners what's so special about Windmill Lane Recording Studios? And what's the history of the studio?
Well, Windmill Lane Recording Studios was started back in 1978, which was 44 years ago, by a sound engineer, Brian Masterson, and a post-production studio owner, James Morris. They looked at and looked into setting up a really good recording studio for Dublin, Ireland, because there was nothing like it at the time. And they invested heavily in all the equipment and so on to make sure that it was a world-class recording studio. It was designed by a guy called John Storick, and John Storick is a famous architect among studios. He designed Electric Lady Studios in New York for Jimi Hendrix. He also designed other recording studios for very famous people like Jay-Z and so on. But he had a unique take on the way a recording studio should be designed. He wanted to, when recording studios were being, designed to be very, very small and sort of dead sounding, he was going for the bigger live rooms, more reverb, more reflections. So you got bigger types of sounds in his studios, and they were amazing. They were really, really good.
Yeah.
So Brian Masterson and James Morris, they knew they were taking a big risk, but luckily in 1980, a band came on the scene into the studio and recorded their debut album. That band was U2, and the album was Boy. So very
Oh,
often
wow.
recording studios, yeah, exactly. Very often recording studios can be associated sometimes with their most successful sort of clients. When you think of Abbey Road Studios in London, you might think of the Beatles. When you think of Sun Studios, you think of Elvis. When people think of Windmill Lane, they think of U2. But that really isn't, the full story, because although U2 helped put the studio on the map, it's all the other clients that came into the studio thereafter. And it was really credit to Brian and James for putting the investment in the first place to ensure that these clients would come and would be happy with the results in which they got. So international acts started to use the studios, coming from abroad to use the studios. And that's what really made Windmill Lane so unique.
Fair enough. That's really impressive. It's impressive repertoire to have like big famous artists coming to your studio in Dublin.
Yeah, and I suppose at the time, when U2 were coming into the studio for the first time, they weren't that famous, when you think of it, it's what came thereafter. But they were using the facilities so well that when they got their engineer and producer in and eventually found that match in the studio, that producer was able to capture the energy in which they had on stage and was able to put that down onto tape at the time. And, it was a highly successful album. And they made a number of albums in Windmill Lane thereafter.
Is there any significance between the studio and Ireland?
Yeah, I think, Ireland would have, a huge music background. There's always plenty of playing and singing at every gathering, whether it be, a wedding or a funeral or any excuse, in a session. So at the time when Windmill was starting, there was no recording studio in Ireland. So all the artists that recorded went abroad. So what Brian and James had to do is win their confidence and say, no, don't go abroad, stay here, do it here, and we will invest the equipment and we'll invest the money with the rooms, with the with the multi-track recording, the correct microphones, the mixing consoles, and they did that, and it worked.
Great. So you might say that it's had an impact on Irish culture in terms of letting Irish musicians record and produce in Ireland.
Yeah, well, without a doubt. And although a lot of people might think, U2 and Windmill Lane Recording Studios, as I said, The story is much more than that. It's everybody and anybody really, and all different styles and genres of music as well is recorded in Windmill Lane. And the studio stayed then on Windmill Lane for 12 years. And James and Brian parted ways in 1990. And Brian moved the recording studios from Windmill Lane to another area, which is about 10 minutes away, 10 minutes walk away, into the Docklands. And that's now in Ringsend Road, 20 Ringsend Road. That was back in 1990. So the studios has been on Ringsend Road now for 32 years. But most people think it's still on Windmill Lane, you know.
Well,
and
makes sense.
And the reason being is that we never put a sign on the front door. We never told anybody, you know, that this was a recording studio. We only put a sign ourselves up on the front door in the past, say, 5 or 6 years. We didn't want people knowing what the building was actually, what was going on in behind those particular doors, you know, because there was a certain amount of, you know, secrecy as well at the same time, you know.
Obviously, yeah. So it actually makes sense to keep the old name that kind of misled where it was.
To some degree, but the name was really well, you know, embedded in,
Established.
and definitely well established. And Brian wanted to have a studio. See, at the time, I think Windmill had a number of different studios that wasn't necessarily on Windmill Lane. Windmill 1 was on Windmill Lane, but Windmill 2 was near Stephen's Green in Dublin, around by, people might know, the hotel, the Shelbourne. And
Yeah.
the Windmill 2 was in behind a car park in there, so no one knew where that one was either. So there was three recording studios, and they all merged into Ringsend. And Brian wanted to
Right.
have the space in order to record bigger ensembles as well. So it was a different chapter for Windmill Lane, but it was a very, very exciting chapter for it as well. All the clients that were using Windmill Lane on Windmill Lane moved to Ringsend for the music, but also the added bonus was that we could now record large ensembles. So film scoring became a big part of the business as well.
Oh, any film score that you might have heard of that was recorded there?
You would know Mission Impossible, and the theme music for that,
Definitely.
the My Left Foot. Yeah, have you seen, Peter? Have you seen The Commitments, which was an Alan Parker film? I highly recommend to you if you haven't seen it. But that was an
Fair
Alan
enough.
Parker film. A River Runs Through It with Brad Pitt. You know, The
Okay.
Talented
Yeah.
Mr. Ripley. Have you seen The Talented Mr.
Yeah.
Ripley?
Yeah.
Recently, we would have done music as well for Disney and so on. But funny enough, then as well, recently we would have done a lot of ensembles for games, for game music. You know, so
Fair enough.
the production is all there to do it.
It's all very varied and many things that are actually done there then.
Yeah,
As in
without a doubt, without a doubt. So, you know, a studio can't afford just to say, we're only going to do rock and that's it. We would be doing rock to Irish traditional to rap to whatever, you know.
fair enough. Are there any famous bands that have recorded that are worth mentioning?
You know,
Well,
every
obviously
time
all of them, but yeah.
every time I get asked this question, I sort of freeze because it's more of a thing of where do you stop, you know? So if I went through the list of artists that have recorded in Wimble over the past 44 years, you're talking about Kate Bush, you're talking about Elvis Costello, 50 Cent, The Cranberries, Depeche Mode, Hozier, Lady
Oh,
Gaga, Nora Jones, Metallica, New Order, Sinead O'Connor, Ed Sheeran, the Spice Girls, Def Leppard, Van Morrison, Rolling Stones, and just the list goes on, you know. And of
I
course, you too.
so what would you do on your tours then? And what tours are on offer?
Well, our tour is unique. It really is, because the visitors are coming to see a working studio. It's not a museum, you know, it's, you know, not a visitor center as such. They're coming to see a working studio that when we're open for tours, we have visitors in. but when we're closed, when we would have a client in or so on. So what
Okay.
we try to do, first of all, is that when a visitor comes into us, we want to explain to them how it all sort of works, how a recording studio works. So we bring them in and we explain to them what is the function of the mixing console, what is the function of the multi-track, and we explain to them how multi-track recording works. And this sort of helps them to lay the foundation for them before they actually go to see the studios themselves. So they can probably appreciate it that little bit more, instead of just going into a room with a desk that has a load of lights on it and so on. And anybody who's sort of uniquely interested in music, or has any interest in music, really, really loves the tour. They really, get a behind the scenes look at all the technology, and we demonstrate how a recording is mixed together. We take the visitors through our gallery of presentation discs from all the different albums that were recorded there. And one of the things that is really unique about that as well is that we try to explain to people the link between those recordings as well. Like for instance, you might have
Oh,
the Corrs may have recorded there, and they would have recorded with the likes of Mutt Lange, who's a very famous producer. He's a top producer. Whereas further on down our gallery would have Def Leppard. They also recorded with Mutt Lange, and they famously recorded Hysteria, if you know that album, with Mutt Lange as well. He's a real perfectionist who ended up being married to Shania Twain. And he recorded Shania Twain in Windmill Lane Recording Studios as well,
fair enough.
So it is a unique experience for people to come around. We try to go around the studios, and we try to explain how it all sort of works and how it all operates. And everybody knows the bands, everybody knows the artists and so on, but they mightn't know the people behind the scenes. As I was mentioning there, Mutt Lange, they mightn't know Steve
Yeah.
Lillywhite, they mightn't know Flood, they mightn't know all the people behind the scenes that really deserve a strong credit for the work in which they've done. Like, you take a band like U2, who are complete perfectionists in what it is that they do, they only want to work with the best. Who is the best, and why do they want to work with them? And that's what we try to explain, to the visitors as well. And they sort of get it by the time they leave the studios. And of course, we want to make it fun as well. So visitors experience a unique listening experience, which is known as binaural recording. And in this binaural recording, we actually introduce the visitor to our ghost, and his name is Cosmo, because any good tour has to have a ghost in it. It's very, very, very important. And
Of course.
and then the finale really is that they go to visit the main studio, which is Studio One, which takes up the entire top floor of our building, which used to be a power station to the trams of Dublin back in its day. And in this studio is capable of holding an 80-piece orchestra. So you can imagine the size of it as
Wow,
well.
that's
And
huge.
and the recordings that have been done there, like, you think, when you listen to Riverdance, everybody would know Riverdance. That was recorded
Mhm.
there. So you can imagine what it must be like with an 80-piece orchestra playing at the same time, coming into that mixing console, which in actual fact we had to crane into the building back in the day as well. Now we weren't there at that particular time, but they craned the mixing console up 3 floors into the side of the wall, which they turned into a window, in order to be able to cater for the size of this beast of a mixing console. And all the equipment back then was massive, a massive expense. Like, as I said, James and Brian had spent a huge investment in their initial, setup. But even, still today, you're always investing in new microphones, you're always investing in effects units, speakers, and
Mm.
some of this equipment is now vintage. They don't make it anymore. And it's actually increased in price because you can't get it anymore. And an awful lot of the equipment is tried to be mimicked by, as well, by computers. So you might see on a computer, you might see plate reverb or whatever it might be. Well, we have an actual plate reverb, the real thing, in Windmill. It's huge, it is massive. And what it is a big metal plate suspended in a wooden box that when you sing or send a signal into it through a speaker, it vibrates this metal inside the box. And then that's your reverb. And you can decide how long the reverb is going to be by a dampener that's on the metal to make it, say 4 seconds long, or you might make it, 500 milliseconds long. It's the real thing, and it's great to see.
Wow. I have to say that sounds, well, also like something that takes up a terribly big amount of space, but that also sounds very incredible. Like, it must be nice to have the tangible process there, as you said, the reverb, that you can actually go see how was this done,
Yeah, like
compared to just the audio editing.
Yeah, certain bands would come into the studio and they'd spend a long time in there, getting the job done. Today it's a bit quicker because the technology is there to allow, if the drummer wasn't absolutely spot on, there's a technology there that will help perhaps make it, more accurate to some degree, Whereas before, you'd have to stay there for days on and nights in order to ensure that the drummer got it right. And no offense to drummers or anything, but they
just an example. They
generally always got it in the neck anyway, to be honest. But the drummer would put a set of headphones on their ears, and they'd be listening to a metronome, and that's all that they would hear. And some drummers weren't, cued in to what a metronome actually did. So keeping time was very, very difficult for them. But that's the whole foundation of any recording or any track, is the rhythm section. So it really needs to be bang on for every other element that's going to be played up on top of it. So it's layered up and layered up and layered up. If that wobbles at the bottom, it's like the foundation is wobbling on a skyscraper. The whole thing is going to wobble at the end. So that's why it took so long to get those type of things absolutely accurate and the way that you want them.
I never knew that was what drummers listened to. I just thought it was the rest of the band or something. No, okay, so it's literally just the metronome, the timekeeping.
The timekeeping would be very important, and the metronome would be very, very important. And of course, they can hear the rest of the band with, an element of the vocal and the guitars and particularly the bass, you know what I mean? But it's their job to make sure that they lock in to the rhythm of the music. And as I said, they did have a hard time in the studios over many years, but there is technology there now that helps that process, is what I'm trying to say. And so bands might be spending as much time in the studio as they used to.
Okay. So how does an artist record at a studio? They book a time with you, they come in, and do they just walk in and play what they like, and then
they generally would send us an email and tell us what the requirements are, and all the requirements are different. You know what I mean? For orchestras, when we do an orchestra, there's a huge amount of preparation done for that orchestra. Even though the session itself might only be, say, 3 hours long, the guys might be spending a day or day and a half prepping everything in the room in order to ensure that it's the way it needs to be. Because once we press record, everything needs to work, and it needs to work in sequence. So we have to test every lead, we have to test every microphone, we test every position, we're testing all phase. So on an orchestra session, there's a lot of assistance on those sessions, and it's a real pressure job as well, because once the orchestra comes in, they need to make sure that once we press record, everything works. Because if they run over a certain amount of time, you can get into overtime then as well. It becomes much more expensive in order to record as well. So for the client, it's important that it all works as well. And I've had in the past a few nightmares myself in recording strings and orchestras where the technology really wasn't there, and it's stressful enough without the technology performing the way you want it to.
Definitely. But to then turn it around, what's been your best experience at the studio?
There's been so many, and there's a number of them I can't mention, really,
Fair enough.
But when we launched the tours of the studios, and it was just before lockdown, I think it was 2 weeks before lockdown, the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and his wife, Sabina, were our guests of honor. And interestingly enough, while I was bringing him around the studios, trying to impress him with our facilities, he then turned around to me and he said, I've been here before. I went, what? You've been here before? He said, yeah, yeah, yeah. Back when I was the Minister of Culture, the Rolling Stones were in the studio recording, and they were in Windmill Lane for, I think it was 6 months, and they're recording the album Voodoo Lounge. And the guys were very interested in seeing a painting by Caravaggio. It's called The Taking of Christ, and it had been recently found in Dublin, this lost painting of the Caravaggio.
Okay.
And so he, as Minister of Culture, drove down the ministerial car and picked up the lads, and they all headed off to go and see it. So that's rock and roll, isn't it?
That's pretty rock and roll. Yeah, that's amazing. I can imagine you were a bit surprised when Michael said that.
Yes, absolutely. And he's the only, we have a wall inside in the studio that all clients that record in Studio One can sign. We might put a photograph of them up on the wall as well. He's the exception that he hasn't recorded in the studio, but he was allowed to sign the wall, and we are very honoured that he did. And he's much loved in Ireland. He really is, and he's done a huge amount of work for culture in Ireland as well.
Fair enough. Apropos of culture, are there any Irish words or sayings that you might share that are relevant to recording studios? Music.
I don't speak Irish. I know I struggle with English, to be honest. I really don't, but I'd love to be able to speak Irish. But qu-eol, agus, krak, and this is a saying. Qu-eol is music, and krak is fun, and it'd be spelt C-R-A-I-C. So we would still use that today in Ireland as it was great crack, you know what I mean? It was great fun, you know what I mean? And so music and fun, and that's what it's all about.
That's words to live by. Do you have any tips for anyone wanting to experience modern music in Ireland?
I suppose when visitors come to Dublin, they probably all have heard of Temple Bar, and Temple Bar would be a real hotspot for tourists. And you probably won't find too many locals, in Temple Bar, to be honest. And yourself, wherever city you are around the world, there is certain areas where a tourist might go. But if you wanted to go and, see a particular band or an artist in Dublin, I would recommend the likes of Vicar Street, Whelan's, which is on Wexford Street. Vicar Street is on Thomas Street. And then there's the Workman's Club, which is on the Quays. I particularly love to see bands and artists in a sort of an intimate surrounding, when you catch them on the way up, because when you go to the massive stadiums that might be 70 or 80,000, you lose it then, to me. You know what I mean? I'm like, when you can't see them, it's difficult, and the eyes aren't what they used to be, but that's what it's about. But when you find an artist where you're close to and you can hear the music intimately, it really is a great experience. I remember going to see Ray LaMontagne a particular time, and we were right next to him as he played, and it was just magical. It really was.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And then finally, where or how can our listeners get in contact to find out more about what you have on offer?
Yeah, absolutely. They can go onto our website, and it's Windmill Lane Recording.com. So there's 3 L's in there. So that's windmilllanerecording.com, and go to tours, and then you can have a look at the calendar. As I said, we are a working studio, and that's what makes it unique as well. As I say, one day we might be doing tours, and the next day we might be doing sessions or whatever in the studio. But you have a look at the calendar and try to book in advance to avoid disappointment.
Yeah, obviously, because since you can't do a tour while you're recording, you shouldn't. It's maybe not as easy to just drop by. Let's put it like that.
This is it. Now, sometimes, and that's what we found in the past, is that's why we started doing tours as well, because very often what we would do is be walking out the door, and there would be someone taking pictures of the building, and you might say to them, do you know what? I think there's one of the studios are free. Do you want to pop in and have a quick look, and we bring them in, and see how they get on. And they just loved it. And then I think it was around 2018 or so when you two were playing across the way in the Tree Arena, which is only about a 10-minute walk from where we are in the Docklands. We decided that we'd open our doors to the fans if they registered with us, so they can come in and have a look at the studio, because we knew we were going to be just bombarded outside the front of the studio with the fans outside there as well. So he said, look, if you register, we'll send you an invite, you can pop along. Unfortunately, it was 2,000 people had registered within 12 hours to come in to see the studios. And we said at that particular point, we couldn't handle that number. So we did a bit sort of a lucky dip, and we picked out 200 people. And rain came down that particular night. It just floored the place, but they all turned up, and they just walked through the building, and they loved it. They really did. So that put it in our heads to say, look, there's something in this that people really, really enjoy it. And if you go on to TripAdvisor, we only have a small amount of reviews at the moment, but they're all very, very positive, and we're delighted with them. And it's something that we'll always keep on trying to improve, because it makes the tour just more interesting, and more interesting for us as well, and more interesting to the tour guides who are actually giving the tours, that we'll constantly keep changing it and altering it to make it better.
Definitely. I mean, it sounds like the place to go if you love music. If you have any love of any artist, basically, or any process of just recording, or if you do it yourself, it sounds like a fun place to go and experience how it's done and how it should be done.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, Aidan, I think this is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to coming to Ireland, and hopefully I'll have time to visit the studio if it's not in use. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.